Hey everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today we are going over the Miami Grand Prix. This was a jam-packed weekend because not only was I there, but it was also a sprint race weekend. We had inclement weather, a lot of humidity and heat, a number of DNFs, and overall a pretty unpredictable weekend. As always, we'll go through the things that happened before the race weekend, the race itself, as well as some news from after the race. And as always, I'll go through your questions, hot takes, and predictions, as well as share some of my own. This was a very full weekend, so we have a lot to get through, so let's just jump right into it. Heading into this weekend, we had a new championship leader in Oscar Piastri, with his teammate Lando Norris close behind and reigning world champion Max Verstappen starting to close in. And when it comes to free practice, sprint race weekends are always a little difficult to kind of judge the car going into the race weekend because we only have one free practice session. If you're new to Formula One and you're trying to understand what sprint races are, when we have a sprint race on the weekend, we have a slightly different format to the weekend. Normally, we have 3 free practice sessions, qualifying, and the race itself. But during a sprint race weekend, like Miami, we have 1 free practice session, and then free practice 2 and 3 are replaced by sprint qualifying and the sprint itself. And a sprint race is a shortened version of the Grand Prix. Same track, same cars, same drivers, but less laps, usually no pit stop, and less fuel. Free practice did kind of hint at what we were expecting to see, with Oscar Piastri having the fastest time and the McLaren continuing to be very quick, as well as really strong pace from the Williams. But what it didn't hint at was that history was getting ready to come when sprint qualifying came around later that day. Despite the fact that Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris came in second and third with incredibly quick pace, Kimi Antonelli, our 18-year-old rookie from Mercedes, became the youngest ever pole sitter in any format in Formula One. And Kimi is one of the biggest stories from this weekend. I think everyone, myself included, was really unsure as to how Kimi would perform in this Mercedes seat. A lot of people felt like this was moving too fast, right? That seat was vacated by 7-time world champion Lewis Hamilton, who was not only incredibly successful and had become sort of synonymous with Mercedes as a brand and a team, but also was the first driver that Toto Wolff brought into the team. For those of you who are not super brushed up on your Formula One history, when Toto Wolff became the team principal of Mercedes, he did sign Lewis Hamilton to come over from McLaren. And while Lewis Hamilton was already associated with Mercedes prior to that, his era at Mercedes really went hand in hand with Toto Wolff's era at Mercedes. And just the visibility of Mercedes as a team and as a brand and their place in Formula One was so inherently linked to this relationship between Toto and Lewis. And so it was really surprising and a bit shocking when the replacement for Lewis was an 18-year-old who had a relatively short racing career. Kimi Antonelli raced his first race in Formula 4 less than 5 years ago. He skipped Formula 3 and went straight to F2, and didn't necessarily have the highest ranked performance in his season with F2 last year. But it's kind of a situation where we all have to eat our words, because when you take all of that into account and you look at this, Kimi Antonelli went from his F4 debut, his very first race in F4, to becoming the youngest ever pole sitter in Formula One history in less than 5 years. And it's something that absolutely points to the fact that not only Toto, but his team can find and identify talent and are willing to invest in building it. And also, I did mention I was in Miami this weekend for the race itself, and part of being in Miami meant that I actually had a chance to interview Toto Wolff. WhatsApp, Mercedes, and Netflix partnered to make a documentary about this decision to put Kimi Antonelli in the seat. It is literally called The Seat, and it highlights this decision-making process that they've gone through. They show the other drivers they considered, the decisions that they were making when they decided to go with Kimi, as well as all of the things and testing that they went through to prepare him. You get to see a lot of that thought process and decision-making process because it's shared through their personal WhatsApp messages on the Mercedes team group chat. And it's a really cool documentary. It's out to the public on Netflix now. And I also had the opportunity to talk to Toto directly and interview him. We talked about that decision to put Kimi Antonelli in the seat, as well as how Kimi has changed the dynamic of the Mercedes team. And we did talk about that record-breaking pole performance. If you're interested in watching that interview, you can see it on TikTok and Instagram now. It's pinned to my profile on both platforms. All of that being said, Kimi Antonelli had an incredible weekend despite actually not winning anything, and despite the fallback that he had from pole in the sprint race, as well as falling a little bit back in the race itself. I think one of the biggest takeaways from Miami is the fact that Kimi is starting to get very comfortable in that car, especially when it comes to pace. If we start to see him out-qualify his teammate George Russell, as well as qualify up at the top in those top 3 slots, the next stage will be him getting comfortable racing properly at the top level. So far, we've seen him have incredible drives in the rain, really great overtaking and defending throughout races, but this was the first time this season, which again has only been 6 races so far, that we saw him perform at a level in qualifying that put him up at the top. And once he becomes a little bit more comfortable driving against the drivers who are qualifying up there, around the likes of Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris, Max Verstappen, we're most likely going to see that this decision to put Kimi Antonelli in the seat was shocking, but Toto Wolff absolutely knows what he's doing. And I think one of the other things that's interesting about that documentary, The Seat, is that we've given a lot of the credit and also so much of the blame of this decision to Toto Wolff himself, but in the documentary, we see more of the people that were involved in that decision and how it gets made. I highly recommend watching it because I think Formula One is actually this sport where we really only see certain visible people as that part of the team, but there are so many people making these decisions and spotting that talent and going through the process of developing these drivers and testing them out before the decision is made to put them in a seat like this. So all of that being said, what a weekend for Kimi Antonelli. Some other surprises from sprint qualifying included Yuki Tsunoda getting knocked out in Q1, and that was because he was not able to get a proper lap in. And in Q2, we see a DNF from Carlos Sainz. The Ferraris continue to have pretty low performance that we're getting unfortunately used to in that sprint qualifying, with Charles Leclerc qualifying 6th and Lewis Hamilton qualifying 7th. Getting into the sprint race itself, we can start with the opening, where we see Kimi Antonelli lose that first position after a move from Oscar that we're starting to get used to. This is a move that he has tried a couple of times and have been successful for him, where he essentially forces his own corner and takes the lead by forcing the other driver off the racing line and sometimes off the track. It's technically not an illegal move, but it is the type of move that we've seen those drivers complain about and say that it is forcing them off the track. From that, we see Kimi Antonelli drop down from 1st to 4th, with his teammate George Russell sitting right behind him in 5th. Later on, we do see George continually push for a driver swap, which I do think is indicative of a little bit of stress that we're going to start to see between the two of them. As Kimi Antonelli continues to improve, we've seen George shift into this leadership position as the older member of the team with more experience and has been kind of applauded by Toto for fitting into that role. However, if Kimi Antonelli, his 18-year-old teammate, starts to outqualify him regularly, it is going to start to put a little bit of tension on that driver for two reasons. One, your teammate is always your biggest competition. They are in equal machinery and expected to be the only person on track who you can be directly compared to for that reason. And two, George does not have a contract for next year wrapped up yet. We've heard rumors that he's nearing the possibility of a 2-year extension. However, none of that has actually come to fruition or been announced yet, if so. And part of that tension is going to be the idea of which of them fits to be the future of Mercedes. Are they a good teammate pair? And even if they are, which one of them has a higher ceiling, so to speak? When we talk about a ceiling in Formula One, we're talking about the full potential that a driver has. With development, with experience, how far and fast can they go? And among any team, not just Mercedes and these two drivers, there's always going to be a continual conversation about which driver has a higher ceiling than the other. Because as contracts come up and as decisions are being made on track in general, you want to favor the driver that you think not only is the best right now, but will be the best for your team long term. This is the same conversation that's happening at McLaren right now with Lando and Oscar. Which of these two relatively young drivers has the chance to take our team the furthest for the longest? And once we figure that out, we should favor that driver over the other because they are the future of our success. So that being said, George Russell asking for a driver swap, saying he's stuck behind Kimi Antonelli is not necessarily surprising, but may be indicative of things and tension to come for the rest of this season. The other big note about the sprint race as we're getting into it was the weather. The rain in Florida and Miami is a kind of a very unpredictable thing. There are moments where you are literally like totally sunny skies, everything's fine, it's humid and hot. And then the next moment it is a literal downpour rain to an extreme torrential way. Last year's race weekend we had no rain, and this year we had a ton of massive big pockets of rain that made things very difficult. Earlier that day we had actually had so much rain that the F1 Academy race was cancelled. And as we got to the sprint race, they were trying to dry the track, but the track was still pretty wet conditions even though it wasn't actively raining at the start of the race. And that means that almost all of the drivers started the race on inters. The only exception to this was Carlos Sainz, who started on full wets. This also meant that we were having pretty big visibility issues at the start of the race during the formation lap, and during the reconnaissance laps, we actually lost Charles Leclerc from the race because he lost control of the car and did tap the wall and have to retire the vehicle. But that tire choice in that rain really defined this sprint race, because like I said earlier, we typically don't actually see a pit stop in a sprint race. It's too short and it's not necessary. Generally speaking, your tires wouldn't degrade to the point that you needed to swap them to be able to finish the race. However, as we were racing, we were also seeing that the track was rapidly drying. And at a certain point, wet tires and inters were no longer going to get you all the way through the race. And so we did see everyone have a pit stop and change their tires. But the defining moment of this race was when you chose to pit. Yuki Tsunoda was actually the first driver to pit and he swapped for mediums. But directly behind him was Lewis Hamilton, and Lewis swapped his inters for softs. And those soft tires were actually a call made by Lewis. We learned after the race was over that Lewis was actually told to box for mediums. And when that call was made, he told them to change to softs instead. The team agreed and he did change to softs, and that is why we were able to see him completely cut through the field and end up P3. Then we have two other big incidents in this sprint race that were related to where everyone finished and to this pit stop that we typically wouldn't have in a sprint race. First, we have the incident between Kimi Antonelli and Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen had come into the pits and was completing his own pit stop, and Kimi Antonelli was coming down the pit lane in order to take his own pit stop. Because of how the championship ended up last year, here, Red Bull's garage is directly in front of Mercedes' garage. If you didn't know, we actually determined the lineup of the garages based on the way the championships finished the year before. So because Red Bull and Mercedes finished next to each other, third and fourth in the championship last year, their garages are directly next to each other. After Max completed his pit stop, he was immediately released by the team to go back into the pit lane. This is something that is on the pit crew to decide and to make sure that it is safe for their driver to leave their pit stop. Unfortunately, Max was released from his pit stop directly into Kimi Antonelli, who was coming in for his own pit stop. This meant that the two cars collided, Max took damage, and Kimi Antonelli could not complete his own pit stop, which resulted in him not only having to stay on his tires for the rest of the race, but having a situation where he came through the pit lane and lost all of the time that you would on a pit stop, but didn't actually get the benefit and advantage of completing a pit stop. So even with having pole position and even losing track position in the race, Kimi Antonelli's race really gets kind of destroyed right here because there's no chance for him to really recover from something like that. Not only does he lose the time, he doesn't have a tire advantage, and he's not really able to make up any space in the race itself. Max himself sustains damage and receives a time penalty for an unsafe release, and really neither driver is to blame for this situation. It's really the Red Bull crew that made the mistake and also caused potential danger. And next we have the Fernando Alonso and Liam Lawson incident, which does cause a safety car, and the timing of that safety car results in Lando taking the lead of the race over Oscar because of a well-timed pit stop and the rest of the race being completed under the safety car, which means that no more passing is made possible in that race. And we complete the sprint race with Lando Norris winning, Oscar Piastri taking second, and Lewis Hamilton rounding out the podium. We also have a couple of penalties after the race, including one for Alex Albon, which drops him out of the points, and one for Yuki Tsunoda as well. That pretty much wraps up the sprint race, so let's get into the Grand Prix itself. Starting with qualifying, we unfortunately saw an immediate drop in performance from Ferrari between the sprint race and qualifying for the actual Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton qualified 12th, and Charles Leclerc only managed to qualify 8th. We saw Lando out-qualify Oscar, and Kimi Antonelli having another great performance, splitting those two McLarens and qualifying P3. Max Verstappen, of course, took pole position, which again is showing us a little bit of a shift in the season's actual competitiveness. When we look at Q3 and the cars that made it and where everyone landed, we've got a Red Bull in pole with Max Verstappen behind the wheel, Lando Norris in a McLaren P2, Mercedes P3 with Kimi Antonelli, another McLaren P4, Mercedes coming in P5, and then back-to-back Williams in P6 and P7. And again, we're seeing a situation, at least in qualifying, where we're seeing multiple different cars be competitive and shake up that qualifying. We didn't see a front row lockout from McLaren here. We saw 3 separate cars in the top 3 positions. And again, that is an exciting situation for just the quality of racing that we're seeing. So let's get into the race itself. I want to talk about the Williams situation first and their race story because it resulted in one of my favorite lines of commentary, which was, "What a time to be alive for Williams." Something that really stuck out to me about this race was the competition between both Alex Albon and Carlos Sainz. And I think this was highlighted for me because while I was in Miami, I listened to James Vowles actually speak at the fan zone. And one of the things he was asked by a fan was the difference between their lineup with Carlos and Alex and their previous lineup with Alex and Logan. And something that he actually spoke on is something that I've been talking about for a while, which is that human beings, regardless of their position in life and what they do, are always going to perform better when under pressure from someone else. Alex Albon was honestly not under a lot of pressure when Logan Sargent was his teammate. Given the way that Logan was performing, Alex just had to really show up. But once it was announced that Logan was dropped and that Franco Colapinto was replacing him, that was the first time we really saw how Alex performed when he had a teammate who was closer to being up to par with him. And that was taken one step further when it was announced that his teammate this year would be Carlos Sainz. Carlos is a race winner and comes from a higher level team and also comes with a higher expectation for him himself because of those moments, which resulted in Alex really performing better than he ever has this season so far. And now that Carlos is getting a little bit more comfortable with that car, in Miami we saw a change in that dynamic and that pressure that comes from the teammate pairing. Carlos actually out-qualified Alex, coming in P6 with Alex coming in P7. But then during the race, we see them being told they are free to race. We see Alex and Carlos swapping positions, Alex overtaking him and then Carlos overtaking him again. And then later on in the race, we find out that Alex was told not to pass his teammate, to maintain position and kind of hold that DRS train as they have done before. And instead, we saw Alex ignore those team orders and actually pass Carlos. When that happened, we saw that Carlos actually dropped down in the order a bit, and ultimately, Alex ends up finishing this race P5, with Carlos finishing behind him in P9. This is something that I'm actually quite interested to see how it plays out as the season moves on. Williams has had a really shocking kind of turnaround. The car has been performing very, very well. And when I listened to James speak, he talked about kind of investing in future development for next year's car, rather than trying to focus on development and upgrades for this year's car. All of the regulations change next year, meaning that any development that they do this year gets basically thrown away at the end of the year. Nothing about the car will stay the same for any team next year. And now that they have gotten gotten this car into a place where it is competitive. They're willing to kind of put a ceiling on their car development for the rest of this year and focus on kind of maintaining that P5 position that they're fighting for. And I think we've been able to see them do so pretty impressively. And it's also pretty promising for what they could look like next year. But it also means that you have two drivers right now that didn't necessarily expect to be in a good fighting position. However, there's this mentality that I think is a little different when you look at both of them. For Alex, he hasn't had a car that he could drive like this before. And so competing for that mid-range slot, for that P5 in the Constructors' Championship, and even just ending up in the points in those top 10 slots every week, that is a huge change and a huge upgrade to what Alex has been experiencing. On the flip side, Carlos is coming over from Ferrari. He is a multi-race winner, and he was fighting for P1 in the Constructors' Championship last year. While the Williams team progression, this car development, and the changes that we're seeing is incredibly impressive for them as a team compared to last year, and of course compared to a number of previous seasons, it is still a step down for Carlos. It still is this big change of him not necessarily fighting for what he used to be fighting for. And so I think the mentality of the two drivers, it's actually quite interesting to see how it works, because Alex can taste this new change. A win for him would be a first, and in his entire career he has only had 2 podiums total. That means out of 110 races across 3 different teams that he has competed for, he has only managed to step onto that podium twice. Carlos, by comparison, has 27 podiums to his name. And so when you look at how these two drivers are going to respond to how they're running, being in the middle of the pack and having a car that actually is functional, it's 2 separate mentalities. One of them is closer to victory than he's ever been, and one of them is still dealing with a sort of fall from grace. And so I think what we're seeing is that Alex is actually becoming more and more competitive with his own teammate in a way that is actually positive, but does result in things like this where he is willing to go against team orders for his own benefit. And it's a really fine line that they'll have to balance. Is this a situation where they do need to reinforce team orders and this idea of teammates and working together? Or is Alex trying really hard to prove that he really deserves to be the first driver, the prioritized driver? Because right now, Alex actually sits P8 in the Drivers' Championship. And of the 37 points that William has scored, 30 of them belong to Alex. And it's an interesting balance. And because I think just psychology-wise, these two drivers are coming out the success of Williams in completely different places, and that is also causing completely different reactions on track. Another thing I want to point out is that at one point, Alex Albon was actually lapping 0.2 quicker than Max Verstappen, which is just wild. This is such a different universe for Williams this season, and it's actually really wonderful to watch. Because as we go through these cycles with teams, sometimes we forget how successful some of these teams that are in back markers used to be. Williams is the home of not only Constructors' Championships, but Drivers' Championships. And we are seeing James Vowles take this team and really turn it around. And I think we're seeing him move this team at the exact pace and expectation that he told you to have of him. And this team is really one to watch, especially when all of the regulations change next year and we have an additional team added to the grid. Another big portion of this race story is the number of DNFs that we had. We saw Ollie Behrman and Gabriel Bortoleto both have massive power unit issues that required them to retire their cars. And then we also had Liam Lawson and Jack Doohan both DNF due to a collision in the very first lap. Jack Doohan immediately had to retire the car after this, and Liam Lawson continued on track for a number of laps, but quite frankly was at a point that he was just losing so much time that I don't know why they left him out as long as they did. The damage to the car was there. It was sustained in an incident that neither of the drivers were actually penalized by race control for, and from where I was sitting at turn 18, it was just this point where you were watching him come around at like 30 seconds later than everybody else, and that gap was just continuing to grow lap after lap. So it really seemed like an inevitable retirement for a long period of time before they finally did retire the car. However, all of those incidents on track that required those cars to actually retire also resulted in multiple virtual safety cars. And this virtual safety car situation is something that I wanted to take some time to explain because it was also a really big portion of a lot of the passing and the results of the race itself that we saw. A virtual safety car and a safety car function slightly differently. In a full safety car deployment, we see all of the cars generally bunch back up, and when the safety car ends, it's up to the race leader to restart the race at the pace that they want to start and at the time that they want to start. The difference with a virtual safety car is that you still can't pass under a virtual safety car, and you obviously must slow down. However, the second that a virtual safety car ends and the race is green flagged again, all drivers can restart to race pace. This means that the virtual safety car gives a lot of chances for passing if the driver has a better reaction time than the driver in front of them. And in this race, we saw a number of passes that came from pretty quick reaction time. And I wanted to make sure I explained that in this episode because it is very different different than an actual safety car. And it did heavily affect this race because of how many VSCs we had. Another incident that happened because of the VSC was George Russell's timing of his pit stop and his ability to come out in front of Max Verstappen when exiting the pit lane. Ironically, he actually didn't have a great stop with Mercedes, but the difference in the time that you lose in a pit stop under a VSC is about 11 seconds versus 20 seconds that you lose in a normal pit stop. So even with a poor performance in his actual pit stop itself, George Russell ended up securing that podium for himself under the VSC. And it was like just by the skin of his teeth that he managed to have that benefit from the virtual safety car as well. Next, I want to talk about the moment that Lando Norris and Max Verstappen objectively lost this race and that allowed Oscar Piastri to really run away with it. In lap 14, after a pretty hard-fought battle, Max lost the lead to Oscar. And then after that, we see Lando Norris catch up to Max, which then results in a long-fought battle that allows Oscar to run away with this race. As the two of them were battling, in one lap, they lost 3 full seconds between them and Oscar ahead of them. And I don't think this was broadcast on the actual race, but you can always access team radio after the fact. And in that team radio, we saw that Max was complaining about his brakes, and we also saw Lando's engineer tell him that Max was complaining about his brakes. There was an interesting strategy moment here, or just like an insight to strategy that I think really highlights the fact that team radios are public, because we saw Lando's engineer tell him that Max was complaining about his brakes, and to try to force Max to screw his brakes, though he did not use the word screw and it was bleeped out of the radio messages. This ultimately did result in Lando putting a specific type of pressure on Max and trying to force him to continue to cause pressure on brakes that he was already saying were failing. And I think this is an interesting point when we talk about Formula One as a sport and when it comes to strategy. In any other sport, you wouldn't have access to the communications between players and their coaches. In a basketball game, for example, you can't send one of your players over to the other team's huddle to listen to what the coach is saying to those players and what plays they intend to call. You also can't hear the team complaining about what's not working on their end and what they need to change. But in Formula One, team radio is public not only to the viewers, but to the other teams. So over the radio, when a driver is complaining about their tire strategy or their brakes or things like that, the other teams can hear it, meaning that someone who's fighting behind you for position knows what you're struggling with. And a lot of the times, that's why we hear these drivers and their engineers speaking in code. If you're looking at Ferrari, for example, why we consistently hear Strat A, B, C, D, all the way through Z, and why McLaren typically uses things like Strat 7 or things like that. As they're going through these team radio conversations, if you're ever wondering why an engineer or a driver is being almost intentionally vague, it's because all of the other teams can hear them. So if they point out their weaknesses, like Max did with his brakes as he was complaining, the other teams can take advantage of that. And it's an interesting point about this sport specifically, because if you have a team that's able to analyze the other team's radios and give you that advantage, then it's a really cool thing. But it also sometimes feels like anonymity would make a very big difference to that. If team radio was private, it would mean that Lando and his engineer and the team behind him would have had to figure out their own strategy and find an overtake without knowing a weakness ahead of them. But because Max is sharing that his brakes are failing, that he's having trouble, it gives them one specific strategy and pain point that they can push against. So I think it's an interesting, unique thing to this sport, that you're also able to kind of have a look in on other team strategies just through their communications. That being said, the battle between Max and Lando really is where all the time gets lost, and where Oscar is given this opportunity to create such a large gap. There's also a point where Lando does pass Max, but he knows that he's done so in a way that will probably cause him a penalty or force him to hand the position back, and instantly hands it back, which was a smart move. It's the least amount of time lost as possible, and it allows him to continue trying to pass him, which he ultimately does. And for the rest of this race, when it comes to McLaren, their race story was really that they were so much faster than everyone else on track. And what I do think is interesting is that I do think Oscar fought for this position in a way that we haven't necessarily seen him do before. But I also think when you look at how quickly Lando was closing that gap, had the fight with Max taken less time, and had he gotten to clean air quickly to try to catch up to Oscar, I think we may have seen a real battle between the two of them for that win. So as much as we are seeing a very strong performance from Oscar over these past 3 races that he has won back-to-back, and 4 out of the 6 races going to him as the winner, I also think it's too early to count Lando out. He's made some mistakes that have cost him wins, but if he can get his head on straight and really focus on the start of the race, and not have these big mistakes that cost him a lot of time, or positions that he ultimately has to fight his way through to get back up to competing for that win, I think Lando still has it in him to be a contender to win this World Drivers' Championship. One thing is for certain, their car is 100% capable of it, and we're seeing them start to run away with this Constructors title. The final gap between Lando and Oscar was less than 5 seconds, and the gap to George Russell in third was over 37 seconds. So we are clearly seeing a very fast and dominant car from McLaren, though we're seeing that in race pace. We did see a very competitive qualifying, which means that it's not time to count everybody else out yet. And speaking of other teams and team radio, I think it's time to talk about the Ferrari situation. When it came to this Ferrari race, their story was very much one of frustration and teammate issues. Clearly, something was changed between the sprint and the Grand Prix, which has continued to happen. We see Lewis Hamilton in particular have these really strong performances in a sprint race, having won a sprint race this season already and coming in third for this weekend's sprint race. Yet and still, when we get to the actual Grand Prix, we see that performance really drop off. And we saw Ferrari running a split strategy for this Grand Prix, which is a large part of what resulted in that tension. Lewis Hamilton did have faster pace than Charles Leclerc at a portion of this race, and he believed that he could catch Kimi Antonelli ahead if he had been allowed to pass Charles. But the decision on whether or not they should swap the cars took so long that we started to see a lot of tension over the radio between Lewis and his engineer. They took so long that Lewis suggested they have a tea break while they were making the decision. We also saw Lewis bring up the fact that in China, he played the team game and allowed Leclerc to pass him when Charles actually had better pace than he did. And it just took lap after lap until they finally made the decision to swap the cars. And at that point, you have to remember that there's multiple laps extra of tire degradation and sitting in dirty air behind his teammate. Then we see Lewis attack and start to cut into that time in between him and Antonelli, but we don't see him make up enough time that it seems justified, and then we start to see Charles Leclerc immediately complain about the same things that Lewis was complaining about. He's just trapped in dirty air, he can't make the pace, and he didn't realize that Carlos Sainz was as close behind him as he was. Neither of these drivers are happy throughout the entire race, and then Ferrari makes the bizarre decision to kind of swap them again, and we just see them continually losing time. So all of this time that was made up for Lewis to actually catch up to Kimi Antonelli is then subsequently immediately lost by swapping the cars, having to slow down, and allowing Charles Leclerc to then have his turn. But again, that decision took so long to make that it didn't really become relevant anymore. And one thing that is true is that if you have made team orders that change the order of the race but do not actually accomplish the goal that you were trying to accomplish, aka you let Lewis Hamilton pass Charles Leclerc with the intention of him catching Kimi Antonelli, but he's ultimately not able to do so, it is standard practice to sort of swap those cars back and undo this kind of change that you made that was a team orders change, not an actual racing action change. However, when you take this much time and you have this much indecision and you can't figure it out, all you really do is not accomplish anything, other than, of course, kind of upsetting both of your drivers. Unfortunately, we continue to see at Ferrari that they desperately need to get on the same page with each other. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton need to get on the same page, their engineers and strategy team need to get on the same page, and we need to figure out what changes are being made that continue to just sort of tank the performance of the car. Because I think if you're a Ferrari fan, if you're a Lewis Hamilton fan, if you're a Charles Leclerc fan, every weekend seems to have some sort of little glimmer of hope where suddenly the car seems to be hooked up, the drivers seem to be doing well, and then everything just falls apart again. And it is disappointing to see because we know that they're still working on this car. They're not like changing and focusing on only development of next year's car, and we're just not seeing them connect in a way that we were hoping they would be. Again, we're only 6 races in. We always could see something change here, and hopefully in this small break that we have coming up before we head to European races, we will see those changes. But it's a tough one, and it's always hard to listen to radio messages like that and that amount of tension between everybody going on, because it wasn't even like one driver was being prioritized and the other one was unhappy about it and that there was some sort of success. It was like both of these drivers were both being prioritized and not being prioritized at the same time. Almost like if you have 2 kids and you let one play with the toy for a period of time, then you snatch it and give it to the other one, and then both of them are pretty unhappy because they both had to share and nobody really got to keep the toy when they wanted it. You know what I'm saying? It's probably a bad analogy, but I just think that we are seeing a just kind of disconnect of what they're looking for, both on strategy and in the car itself. However, they did have a mixed bag weekend, right? Lewis Hamilton has this incredible run for the sprint race, and I think that gives us some excitement and some hope. And then we kind of see it all sort of fall apart, and we don't see a balance between their teammates in the actual Grand Prix. What I think about Ferrari and where they stand right now is that they have so much talent. They have Fred, they have Charles, and they have Lewis Hamilton. And there are these moments where you see these glimmers of old Lewis Hamilton and his performance. We know how much Fred cares about this team and how many strong positive changes he's made to the team since he came over. But we also are seeing this lackluster performance from the team as a whole. So hopefully we'll see those changes before our next race. And that sort of hits all of our highlights from the race. Other notable moments include Fernando Alonso spinning despite not having any kind of actual contact, Liam Lawson's long forced retirement and the fact that I think he should have probably retired earlier than he did, and Yuki Tsunoda managing to finish in the points despite a 5-second time penalty, with Isaac Hadjar losing out on that last point slot by less than 0.2 of a second. So let's get into some of the moments after the race. We do have this moment while the podium drivers are being transported to the podium itself in Miami, where we actually see them do their driver interviews on sort of the back of a truck. Lando Norris refused to sit down for his, saying that he had been sitting for the last 2 hours. And also, I think his frustration was kind of outward as opposed to inward like it usually is. I'm just talking specifically about this one interview. I'm sure there were other moments where we did see some of that classic self-deprecation from Lando, but there was this moment where he was asked about Max and he responded saying that if he does does try to go for it, people complain. If he doesn't try to go for it, people complain. This is just the way that Max races. And I think that there's a potentially interesting thing there, and maybe this is just me hopeful and a little bit wishful thinking for Lando, because I really would like to see him stay in this championship fight personally. But it felt like there was a bit of a change in the way he was processing this, in a way that he was sort of not being aggressive, but sort of shrugging off the fact that he's not going to be able to make everyone happy, and that no matter what he does, he's going to be criticized. And personally, this is probably overanalyzing one small moment here, but I think if he can get to the point where he does sort of understand that he's not going to be able to change people's minds, that he's always going to be criticized, and that even when he has a great race, people are going to find things to complain about, if he can move past what other people think of him and really just focus on his own performance, I really think that he has the potential to stay there and to really put up a real title fight here. So again, just kind of maybe a little bit of a wishful thinking, but I did feel like there was a mentality change there from Lando. Then during the podium presentation, another really cool moment is that we have the first woman on the podium since 2022. For those of you who don't know, during the podium presentation, a representative from the winning constructor is sent to also receive a trophy. At the Miami podium presentation, that representative from McLaren was actually their CMO. Her name is Louise McEwen, and she was the first woman to be on the podium since 2022. So just a really cool moment, a nice moment for both visibility and for her personally to get to celebrate. And then, of course, the biggest news that has come out post-race, Oliver Oakes, the team principal at Alpine, has resigned. Alpine put out a statement saying that this was mutually agreed upon and that Flavio Briatore will be taking over his duties as team principal. Now, there's a lot of wild things to talk about here, but we'll start at the beginning. Oliver Oakes now departing marks a new chapter in a long book of insane team principal changes at Alpine. In 2022 and 2023, we had Otmar, who you may remember as the team principal who was in charge when they lost Oscar Piastri, and he was replaced by Bruno Feynman, who was then quickly replaced in 2024 by Oliver Oakes. But Oliver Oakes is kind of a different situation, because last year we saw him really focus in with this team and make some big changes, which resulted in them finishing P6 in the Constructors' Championship, which was much better than they've been doing. However, this year they've fallen to P9, and Flavio Briatore is absolutely throwing around his power. Now, Flavio is kind of a complicated individual, and his return to Formula One has been a big news story. Because if you're not super familiar with Formula One, you may not know that Flavio Briatore has not only been caught up in one cheating scandal, but two. He was the mastermind behind Crashgate. The short version of this is that Fernando Alonso's teammate was asked to crash intentionally in order to give him an advantage, in which he ended up winning that race. You can hear more about that story and how Flavio fits into the Alpine history if you go back to the Alpine history episode that I did a while back. But all this is to say that we're seeing changes at Alpine and that Flavio is kind of an intense individual to be making those changes. And it definitely lends itself to these rumors that Jack Doohan is going to be out of his seat before we get to our next race, and that Franco Colapinto will be the one to replace him. But this surprising announcement about Oliver Oakes really points to that being the case next. And personally, I think it's going to be an interesting situation. Flavio coming back to Formula One after personally having been given a lifetime ban that was then ultimately shortened is pretty shocking to begin with. But at the same time, what you can't deny is that he did build these huge eras for these teams where they were winning. And there's a lot of lines blurred when Flavio's in charge, but one thing that does generally happen is that people win. And so it's hard to say whether or not this is going to be a benefit for Alpine or if this is going to make this a pretty toxic environment overall. In terms of whether or not we'll see Jack leave and Franco replace him, we'll have to wait until the next race to find out. Okay, quick update. As I was literally editing this podcast episode, Franco Colapinto was officially announced by Alpine to replace Jack Doohan. Starting at the next race, he has been given a 5-race contract. And this was something that was heavily rumored but is now official. So if you've been listening and you were like, oh, didn't Franco Colapinto just get announced? Why is she saying that we should look for that? It's because I was in the middle of editing this. And we've had a pretty insane day for Alpine. So now officially one of the biggest stories to look forward to in the next race is Franco Colapinto's return to Formula One and unfortunately Jack Doohan's departure from it. So that pretty much wraps up the race itself, as well as the sprint race qualifying and the news that came out after this weekend. So let's jump into your questions, predictions, and hot takes. Okay, first question. Is there any possibility that Ferrari can bounce back later in the season? For this one, I think it's hard to say. It's one of those sort of never say never situations. And I kind of hope that the disaster that felt like this Grand Prix, the radio communications, the strategy calls, could be a forced turning point for them. The tension between the two drivers and the team itself, hopefully that's something that's pushing Fred to make these changes that need to be made in order to run the team a little bit better. I think that would take a really strong and big change and ultimately a really immediate one. And I'm not sure that we're going to to see that from Ferrari, as much as I would love to say never, and as much as Ferrari fans particularly and delusionally love to never say never. I don't know that we're going to see that happen, both on the constructors and the driver's side, just because there are so many things that just aren't working right now, and it's hard to believe that very quickly they could turn around and make everything work the way it needs to. But again, would I be sad to see it? Absolutely not. So here's hoping that Fred's feeling a little bit better about the whole situation and makes some changes, and hopefully, miraculously, the car has an upgrade package that works as well. Why did Alpine's team principal resign? This we did obviously talk a little bit already, but ultimately I think this strongly points to the fact that Alpine desperately needs to kind of turn their plans around, and we're seeing this issue and this pattern actually repeat when it comes to team principals there. We've now seen 3 team principals in a row be replaced, and so this is a rough one. I think it points to a large management shift with Flavio coming back, and potentially a driver shift, a culture shift, and a lot of things that are going to change at Alpine as a whole. One thing we do know is that Alpine released one statement, and in that statement said they will not be commenting any further. So we may never know much more specifically. Getting into hot takes, predictions, and just comments from the race, we have loved seeing a fire in Lewis this weekend, and I actually agree this is a really good point. We saw a glimmer of excitement from him in the sprint race itself, calling his own strategy, cutting through the field, and potentially could have cut even further through the field had the safety car not happened. I think during the sprint race, we saw just this old version of Lewis that we've all been missing, and during the Grand Prix, we also saw frustration, which I actually think is important when it comes to a driver who used to be a champion and is not performing at that same level. When you don't see the frustration and that fire from Lewis, it means that he's content with where he is. When you do see Lewis pushing back, calling his own strategy, and asking for different decisions from the team, it means that he is not content with losing. And I do think that that fire is something that we've heard him talk about losing for a little bit, a belief that he did not think he could ever be good at this sport again. And hopefully this is a turning point for him as well, where we can see him say, it's time to focus and I'm going to make this team do what I need them to do. At least that is my hope personally. And then completely on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have hot take, Lewis Hamilton is losing his skill like Fernando, great person, okay driver. Okay driver being associated with a driver like Lewis Hamilton is always a bold take to me. And I also would disagree that this is like the Fernando and Alonso situation. Fernando really hasn't had any glimmers of success in a bit. And again, like in this weekend, we literally saw him spin around on his own untouched by any other driver on the track. I think Fernando in some ways definitely has lost a lot of his luster, and I don't see him getting into that same space where he has a glimmer of who he used to be as a driver. But Lewis, even in this weekend alone, we saw him have an incredible sprint race. We've seen him really improve and kind of get back into himself. And we see him having, like we just talked about, the fire of wanting to be a champion again. And we've already seen him perform well this season. He's already won a sprint race. I think Lewis is still Lewis, and I think Ferrari is clearly working through things that don't have anything to do with him. Hot take, Lando is able to finally find his form and wins the WDC. This, I just think I actually really want to see this. I have nothing against Oscar. I have nothing against any of the other drivers in this championship. I just think that Lando winning would actually be a great narrative. And something about him has really endeared me to him this season and last season. I was actually pretty hard on him last season when we were seeing him try to fight for the championship with Max, and the changes and the mistakes that he made, the mentality changes that I just think that he wasn't all the way there yet. And this year things have really changed for me. I think there are a lot of things that he could still work on, like any driver could work on, but I actually really want to see him lock in and focus on this fight, because I think that a lot of the issues that he has are these small mistakes that cost him a lot. And Oscar, by comparison, has really capitalized on the mistakes that Lando himself has made. And this week was one of the first races that we saw him really truly fight for it. And once we saw Lando get into clean air, we were seeing him move so much faster than Oscar. And so I think when you compare these two drivers, one of the things that is frustrating is that I actually think side by side, Lando has just made small mistakes more frequently than Oscar has. And oftentimes the battle between Lando and Max gives Oscar an opportunity to move past them. And so it's hard because I think if those mistakes weren't there, it would be a much more neck and neck intense fight. And also I think that there's so much against Lando in terms of like public perception and things that are said about him. There's that awful section of Drive to Survive last season where we saw all of the team principals say that they would take Oscar over Lando if given the option. And sometimes I just like to see people prove other people wrong. I'd like to see Lando kind of turn around and prove everyone who's doubting him and his mentality and giving him this sort of soft boy label. I'd like him to turn around and stand on top of his car and call himself a world champion. I think it would mean a lot to a lot of people, and I think it would be interesting, but it does require him to lock in like this hot take says. There are 2 comments about Oscar's gritty. And I intentionally didn't talk about this or comment on it when I was doing my recap, because one of the things I have talked about before is that I wish Oscar was a little bit more like celebratory and excited when he wins, but that gritty was kind of painful to watch. but I guess be careful what you ask for, right? Lewis would be doing better on virtually any team. This one is kind of a hard one, and I think one of the interesting points actually is looking at where Mercedes stands and whether or not it was a decision that he should have made to leave. I think narratively wise, it's been great. I think business wise, leaving for Ferrari has obviously been a very positive thing for him. But I think there are some things that we've lost from Lewis, and we're also seeing Mercedes really actually kind of break through those car issues they were having last year. And so the hard thing is that, like, looking back on it, is he going to feel like this was the wrong decision? Also, one of the things that I will say, and I wonder how other people feel about this, something must have changed in Lewis's contract when it comes to Ferrari itself, because I really miss Lewis Hamilton Fashion Week. We've seen Lewis have such an impact on the Formula One paddock and what these drivers wear when they arrive, and we have seen an insane amount of team kit from Lewis Hamilton fashion icon. And I really miss his arrival outfits. He was the co-chair of the Met Gala this week, and we're just seeing him show up in team kit. And I want to talk to whoever put that in the contract, because it's not working for me personally. And lastly, we have Alonso probably won't make it to 2026. This is actually, I think, a big thing that I've been talking about. I really think that this is a possibility. I think with the changes that are being made at Aston Martin, with the Honda partnership, with these rumors swirling about whether or not Max stays at Red Bull, I think there are so many options that Aston Martin has, especially with the amount of funding that they have. They have Adrian Newey coming in. They're going to be this kind of covetable team. And I am curious whether or not we see Fernando Alonso retire early because of his performance and open up that seat to someone who may be able to be a little bit younger and a little bit higher performing in that space. In terms of other things to look out for as we move ahead, how things shake out at Alpine with the loss of the team principal, whether Ferrari can upgrade the car and focus on their kind of team dynamics, and again, the team dynamics over at McLaren. If you'd like to be able to send in your questions, hot takes, and predictions for future races, make sure you are following me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. You can always send in your questions and thoughts in the comment section of the podcast episode on YouTube. And on Instagram stories, I also open it up for your questions before I record the episode. Additionally, you can join the Grid Chat Discord server where we watch the races together. We have a whole channel just for questions, and I always check in with you guys before I record the episode. That is a really fun time, especially if you watch Formula One by yourself. It's nice to have a group to watch it with, even if it's just over text chat. And this week, I'm going to point out, make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube. I will have a full Miami recap coming out there that will be all video and really cool, and also some content specifically on F1 Academy, because I was with F1 Academy when I was in Miami. I had a chance to talk to some of the drivers, to cover a lot of what was going on and get some behind the scenes footage for you guys, and I want you to be able to see that whole recap, so it'll be a really cool thing. So make sure you are subscribed on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, and of course be sure to join the Discord server. Link for all of those things are in the episode description down below, and I will see you very soon.